Delivering effective feedback serves as one of the core functions of our roles as snow sports instructors. But providing feedback, let alone receiving it, can put us into some delicate situations. How can we deliver effective feedback that not only connects with our students, but continues to develop our relationship with those students without risking negatively impacting trust or their emotions? In this Tech Talk, Katie Brinton shares her methodology on how to not only improve our delivery of feedback to our students, but how to prioritize and better manage our emotions when we are the students receiving the feedback. In addition to her role as a PSIA Eastern Region Examiner, Katie serves as the Eastern Board Vice Chair, as well as the Senior Editor of Ski Area Management Magazine. Please enjoy this episode of Okemo Tech Talks, brought to you by the Okemo Ski Ride School.
I want to start with a story. So you've got the learning connection model up on your screen. But before we get into that, I want to tell you about an experience I had a few years ago. I went out skiing with a buddy who wanted to workshop this activity that he was trying out, this teaching activity. So I said, sure, yeah, that sounds fun. It was a pinball is what he called it. And the idea was that in dynamic performance, medium radius turns, you want to carry energy from apex to apex, like a pinball bouncing off the walls. I was like, sounds great. So we go out, we do the activity, and I suck at it. And that was not what I expected. So he starts, helping me work through it. Like, we'll try this. And, I was not improving. I was getting really frustrated with the whole process. And at some point, we kind of hit the pause button, and he turns to me and he's like, you don't really like hard fun, do you? Like, what do you mean? I do hard stuff. I don't mind doing hard stuff. That's fine. He was like, no, I just mean you like to be good at things. I was like, well, who doesn't like to be good at things? And we kind of wrapped that conversation up and decided maybe we'd shift away from workshopping the activity and workshopping my skiing as a result of the activity, and maybe just go make some turns. That improved my mood considerably, but I went away from that thinking about two things. One was that I really needed to improve my dynamic medium radius turns. And the other was a curiosity about myself, right? When I was willing to be more honest, I admitted that I do get frustrated when I'm not immediately successful at something. And I started thinking about, what are the things that impact the experience of giving or receiving feedback. And so when you look at this learning connection model in front of you, there's the student, there's me, there's my frustration, the type of fun that I find gratifying, the type of learning that I like. And then there's this outer ring of, the instructor, their decisions and their behavior. And so we're going to start by thinking about the instructor decisions and behaviors, and we'll circle back to the me part, which is also going to be the you part. But to kick us off, I'd love for you all to take a minute to think about a time you received feedback and you balked at it. And give yourself a moment to consider why that feedback was so difficult to receive. It doesn't have to be an incident that occurred on snow. It can be something that happened in your other parts of your professional life or other parts of your personal life. But, take a few minutes to recall who was involved, what the circumstances were, what was said, and what your reaction was to it. All right. So the vast majority of you said that the thing that mattered most was what was said. Then that was followed by how it was delivered, who delivered it, and when it was delivered. So I think that this is a really interesting response, because for me, the when in my story, I think, played a big role in my negative response to that feedback. I had gone out with the expectation that I would be providing feedback, that we were workshopping someone's activity, rather than that I would be the recipient of the feedback. And that environmental factor, the expectations that I had, the when of it all was really big for me. But I think the what and the how play a huge role in how we process feedback. And the who has a lot to do with whether you trust someone, right? Whether there's sort of meaningful communication around the feedback. So when I think about the what and the when, let's start with the when. I think the when is sort of goal alignment, right? Was the feedback solicited? Did you want feedback in that moment? And was it targeted? Was it relevant to what you were doing? Achievability, that's sort of the how it was delivered, right? Was the feedback that was delivered to you actionable and attainable? I think as an extension of the how something was delivered, right? Was feedback delivered in a collaborative relationship, right? Were you a partner in getting to that feedback, or was it feedback that was dictated to you, right? That's a big part of how. And then I think the what has a lot to do with sort of too much too soon. There's the topic, right? Again, was feedback solicited? Was it targeted? But there's also, the volume of feedback. There's the feedback that was bite-sized and appropriately paced or not. So my guess is when you look at those questions and you think about the incident you were asked to recall, the answer to those questions is probably largely no, right? The feedback wasn't solicited or targeted. It wasn't actionable or attainable, wasn't bite-sized or appropriate, and you weren't a partner in the process. So when we think about how we can improve our feedback delivery, that's the sort of template for us, right? If you want to deliver better feedback, you need to align goals, right? You want to make sure that the feedback is welcome and it is relevant. So I think about, validation is feedback. So is constructive criticism. But if I've come to you looking for validation and you come back to me with constructive criticism, I might not welcome that. So you have to have a sort of mutual understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. And then I think, more specifically, relevant feedback speaks to short-term or long-term goals. We see this a lot, I think, out on the snow. As instructors, we identify all kinds of challenges that students are having, and we tell them, this is what you need to do. And we ignore what their aims are, right? So if what I want for you isn't what you want for you, then we aren't aligned. Now, that doesn't mean that when you're delivering feedback or building out a lesson that, the student should be dictating the entire framework of that, right? I think that this is where collaboration comes in, right? You should be collaborating with your student in developing your feedback, right? So feedback is often more effective when the learner is a partner in the diagnosis, right? And I think that means you are soliciting impact from them, right? You're asking for some self-awareness in their performance, whether you're talking about skiing or snowboarding performance or teaching, right? Because that's another thing that we help coach folks on is how they learn, how they teach. But you are asking them to partner with you in setting goals and analyzing what's happening. And then you're having a meaningful conversation, right? Feedback should be a dialogue, not a monologue like this is, where you're just talking at people. You want to talk with them. All right, good feedback should be impactful, right? It should be actionable to that end. I think that one really important way to ensure that your feedback is impactful and actionable is to focus on do's rather than don'ts, right? It's often easier to replace a behavior or movement rather than to tell someone to stop doing something. I can tell you to stop doing that all day long, but that's unlikely to affect a real change. And then this last piece is bite-size it, right? effective feedback should be strategic and it shouldn't overwhelm students. So I think when we talk about the feedback avalanche, right, it's easy to envision a scenario perhaps that you have found yourself in as someone giving feedback to students, or that you have found yourself in as someone receiving feedback in a clinic environment where you just get a lot of it, right? Hey, I want you to, tip your foot that way and point your knee there, and you need to move your center of mass there. And we tend to not be able to act on multiple things at once. So if you want to set your students up for success, you have to pace yourself, right? I like to think of the order of operations. I don't know if any of you remember PEMDAS from math class, but it is an order of operations for solving multi-step sums. A mnemonic, P is parentheses, and then you have exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. And in order to solve for an accurate sum, you need to solve the functions in that order. And I think that we can apply that to our strategies for filtering the feedback we're delivering and picking just a chunk of it, right? A mouthful for our students. So, order of operations in skiing or snowboarding might look like learning progressions, right? That sort of first turn to a stop, to wedge Christie, to, parallel turns, to carved turns, and, variable dynamic performance. Or it might look like phases of the turn, right? Tackling, initiation, shaping, and finish. Another way I think about order of operations is going from big to small, right? So in my role as an editor, it doesn't make any sense to start fine-tuning, that word choice or that semicolon if you're missing content, or you need to reorganize the text in order for it to make sense. So you want to start with big learning opportunities before moving into fine-tuning. So I think that these 4 tools, aligning goals, collaborating, being impactful, right? That means giving actionable feedback that pays attention to, your students' mindset and their skill set, and providing feedback in bite-sized portions can really set you up for success and set your students up for success. Now, there are other frameworks that can help provide some structure to how we deliver feedback. One of them is SBI. SBI stands for Situation, Behavior, Impact. And this is something that PSIA-AASI has adopted in the last couple of years to help us be more objective and accurate and impactful in our feedback delivery. I see that many of you are using it some of the time, and I would be curious if anyone is willing to share, when you use it some of the time, is that because of habit? Is that because you're not as comfortable with it yet, or you don't find it effective in all situations? In the interim, though, I'll tell you a little bit about why I think we should be using it more. If you want to provide more effective feedback, structuring your feedback by outlining the situation in which something occurred, the behavior that occurred, or the movement, right, if you're using it for movement analysis, and the impact of that behavior or movement anchors feedback in cause and effect relationships, right? If you do X, then Y happens, right? Behavior impact. It also establishes a common language around short-term objectives, right? In outlining a situation, whether that situation is, when you initiate your wedge turn, or the situation is, when you talk to the group, or setting up your lesson environment, establishing the situation provides us with a clear picture of what we're both talking about. And then I think it promotes evidence-based assessment and evaluation, right? Again, by anchoring this in cause and effect and behavior and impact, it's not about my bias or what I think is happening. It's about what you're seeing. What are the concrete observations you can make? And I think that all of that has a tremendous amount of value because it allows us to manage emotional risks and build trust with students, right? So if you can make your feedback more specific and more objective, it becomes less personal. And I think that you can set yourself up as a sort of authority on what is happening. And being authoritative, while not always, you don't want to be dictatorial, I think. You do need to establish some kind of authority on a subject. So, SBI. Brandon, did anything pop up in the comments, or are people unwilling to reflect on their SBI usage?
I haven't seen anything yet, but I did share my own, which I can vocally share. And I said that, like, for me, it's definitely a matter of habit. SBI is a relatively newer thing to me. It's been something that's popped up in the last few years and gotten quite a lot of talk about it. But for me, it's like I've gotten pretty good at as far as like describing behaviors and in a pretty objective and like non-judgmental manner, but always tying it to a specific situation and its impact is something that I can personally say I don't always do the best job of doing. And like, I mean, an example of this was just yesterday. We were out training and I delivered the feedback to somebody that I said something about, hey, your highest edge angles on the steep terrain we were on is occurring at the very end of your turn. And I kind of made the assumption that they would be able to interpret that as the impact. And I was missing that. And so I had to go back and re-describe it to include those things to make that feedback more impactful.
Yeah, right. Why does it matter if that's the thing you're observing, if that's the behavior? Why do we care? And I think that I'm in the same boat, right? I find that I don't use it every time. I try very hard. I am trying to teach myself to apply this framework in all contexts. But I think that, like you, I might be good at outlining the situation, right? We're working on skating and, your skis are, going, they're shaping rather than tracking out. Let's change that. But I don't necessarily always connect it to the why. Why does that need to change? And I think that the better we get at utilizing cause and effect relationships, the better our feedback is. So, some of your ability to utilize SBI relies on your technical understanding, right? It's a lot easier to describe impacts, cause and effect relationships when you're really comfortable with those yourself. But I think that we can still take the need to be specific and targeted into all of our feedback, even if we're still refining our own technical understanding skills. Someone said they use it when they teach young kids to keep things simplified and short, so they don't lose interest. Another person, that was Riley, Darcy, observed that they use it more for MA than for like other instruction coaching situations. Someone noted that SBI helps them to individualize their coaching rather than applying a rote program to their lesson. I think that that's a really great observation. SBI also requires you to give individual feedback typically rather than group feedback, which we can be guilty of. So let's go to the flip side of this, right? Receiving feedback is a whole different ballgame to giving feedback. And I think that there's huge opportunity for growth here in developing some greater self-awareness about why we respond the way we do, right? Feedback is not personal often, but it often feels personal, right? Even when you've asked for feedback, even when you're out on the snow and you say, I would love some specific things to work on to improve my skiing. Sometimes that feedback feels like a personal attack. So I think that managing your emotional response to feedback is really key to improving your ability to take feedback and act on feedback and prioritize feedback. So I would love for you all, if you have a pen and paper or some kind of writing implement and some kind of writing surface hereby, to grab those. And we'll do a little self-reflection here. But I want to ask you, how does it feel to receive feedback? And to start, we'll use a poll, but then we'll switch to our personal writing implements. So the vast majority of you said it depends on the circumstances. And I think that's true for a lot of people, right? Like we outlined earlier, the environmental factors play a big role in how we receive feedback. I will say that for me, receiving feedback often feels like I've done something wrong. It's a knee-jerk reaction. It's not one of my finer qualities. And it's interesting that I am a writer and a ski coach, because I spend a lot of time getting feedback in both of those capacities. So clearly I'm not opposed to it, but I cannot help the part of me that gets frustrated, that thinks that I should be able to do it even when I can't. You know, that story that I shared with you at the beginning, right? Where as I couldn't perform the activity to my expectations, I continued to get more frustrated rather than going, oh, great, it's a learning opportunity. And hey, we were here to workshop the efficacy of this activity. And isn't it great that I can't do it, because now we can see whether you can coach someone to understand it. I was like, well, why do I suck at this? Shouldn't I be good at it? And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll, because I think the second part of a question about how something feels is, how do you respond when you feel that way? So for myself, when I get frustrated, which can be my knee-jerk reaction to feedback, I tend to respond in a number of ways. Like, I might shut down, or I might get sort of short-tempered. Sometimes I cry. I have certainly cried in the aftermath of tryouts where I was unsuccessful. That kind of feedback hits hard. I might, clench my jaw, disengage, be eager to move on. So again, take an opportunity to reflect on how you said you feel when you receive feedback, and think about how you respond. Jot a couple things down, and then I'm going to throw a few more questions up there for us. So I'll give you, a minute here to make a note or two. I see some observations in the chat. Tink observed that in my response to receiving feedback, I must have gotten straight A's. Tink, often And sometimes I cried when I didn't. So it's a lifelong habit that I'm trying to break. Wes noted that if feedback goes on too long or becomes repetitive, he shuts down, right? So there's certainly, again, those circumstantial and environmental factors. But as we're going through this activity about receiving feedback, this will be most impactful for you if you think about your specific reactions rather than the environmental considerations, right? So, why do you shut down when the feedback goes on too long or becomes repetitive? So that's disinterest, presumably. Or maybe it's because you need to move and you like to learn by doing. But I think that the more honest we can be with ourselves, the more benefit you will get out of this little activity here. So I think that there are a number of things that are a number of feelings that are often common in receiving feedback. And I've kind of outlined these here. And I'd like you to take a minute to think about how you respond when you're unsure of yourself. How do you respond when you make a mistake or fail at something? How do you respond when you are successful or accomplish a goal, right? Not all feelings are negative and not all responses are negative. How do you respond when you agree with someone's point of view? How do you respond when you disagree with someone's point of view? Because that certainly has happened in feedback environments for me. How do you respond when something is easy versus when something is hard? So again, take your writing surface and your writing implement and jot down a few thoughts. Duke noted that when feedback goes on too long or becomes repetitive, as the horse, they feel beaten to death. Jeffrey noted that, how he responds depends on his own focus. He's most concerned with being right or concerned with benefiting from rejected feedback. For better or for worse, that focus determines the response and to what extent he's able to benefit from the feedback. Brandon said he needs time to do and figure it out when he's struggling with something. Feedback needs to be short or else he gets frustrated like Wes. Definitely can disconnect with a point of view that he doesn't agree with, rather than leaning into trying to understand someone's perspective, which I can sympathize with completely. Another person, Diane, noted that, some of her response depends on how successful she was in executing, right? Is the feedback, I suppose, is it positive reinforcement or is it, criticism? Does that change how you respond to something, right? Tink says that he tries to practice an approach that identifies my role in the exchange. However, my go-to response is often defensive. I also now practice not giving that a voice. I think that Tink really speaks to this idea that self-awareness is key to answering the question, not just how do I respond to feedback, but how would I like to respond instead, right? Are there positive behaviors you want to carry through? Mark reflects that, he likes to digest it, reflect on feedback, relish over it. He's grateful. Those all seem like positive things you want to keep doing, right? But there might be behaviors that we want to change. And the only way you can start to change something is to identify it. That's why we, spend all that time doing movement analysis for students. We have to help them identify what they need to tweak in order to reach whatever goal they have there. We have, I welcome feedback as long as it's followed with positive, easy to follow corrective actions, right? Good feedback is actionable. Riley says, if I'm prepared for feedback, I usually handle it well and react well. I was really feeling confident and I thought I did something right, then the feedback can make me feel frustrated and upset with myself, sometimes also defensive. So mindset really matters, right? When you think about that sort of goal alignment piece and that collaboration, right? That idea of being prepared for feedback. Is it welcome? Is it relevant? Have you taken your students' mindset into consideration? Allison says, my least favorite feedback is patronizing positive feedback. If I didn't do something that required skill, thought, practice, problem solving, etc., I don't want feedback. Riley agrees. Some people really like reinforcement, but sometimes it feels overwhelming and I don't like it anymore. Don says, I evaluate the feedback, especially when I disagree. Who's giving it is super relevant. And Sally says, I feel similar to Brandon. I need time and to look for an improvement. You know, I think one of the things that is so interesting about this is while there were lots of commonalities that people expressed, people have very different ways of processing feedback, right? So even just understanding that can help change how you approach your students, right? What works for someone doesn't work for everyone, but, you know, I'll pat myself on the back and say a number of the things that you highlighted are things that we've already noted can improve your feedback delivery, right? Making sure that you're aligned on goals, that your audience is receptive, making sure that your feedback is actionable, digestible, not bite-sized, not long-winded, making sure that you're collaborating, that there's some trust in that relationship. So thank you all for sharing. I thought those are really interesting insights. And I would encourage you now, after that reflection, to think about, is there anything that you want to change or that you should be aware of when you put yourself into a situation like a clinic, for example, where you're on the receiving end of feedback? Can you open yourself up in new ways to that feedback by shifting your mindset? So that is up to you to take action on it and to identify if there are things that are worth tweaking about how you respond to things.
Great.
Okay. So the other piece of managing the avalanche on the receiving end of feedback is like, what do you do with it? Right? So there's your response. There's the defensiveness or the gratefulness or the boredom, the disengagement, or the need for reflection, the need for distance, the need for practice. But I think that most of us, given that we're snow sports instructors, are in an environment in which we receive a lot of feedback, often from different sources, sometimes related, sometimes not related. And it can really snowball, right? The avalanche can really grow as it slides down the mountain and sweep you up in it. And it can be hard to make sense of what to do with that feedback. So I don't know how many of you have worked with Google Docs or Word documents using track changes, but it's a great little tool when you're editing a document or collaborating on a document and you want the person you are sharing that document with to be able to see what you've deleted, what you've added, and whether you have any comments you're providing. And when you receive that document with the additions, the deletions, the comments, you have a number of options in track changes. One is that you can accept all of the changes. You can just hit a button, they all get blended back into the text, and poof, it's done. The other thing you can do is reject all of the changes. You can go, no way, I don't want your input, screw that. I don't think either of those are excellent strategies for managing feedback. So I think the best track changes function you can take into your life is the accept or reject change and move to the next, right? When you do that, the document, when you accept the change, it's, you're going to a specific place in the document, you're looking at it, you're seeing how it fits within the bigger picture, and you're saying, yes, that worked. Or you're rejecting it and you're saying, no, I think the way I was doing it before worked better. And I think that with each piece of feedback you get, you have to decide actively what to do with that, right? Is that something you want to take on board? And is it something you want to take on board now? Or is it something that has to be filed aside? The things that influence your decision making there, we've talked about quite a lot, right? So what are your goals, right? Where, who gave you the feedback, right? Do you trust them? Was this something you're collaborating on and you felt a part of, or was this like some throwaway comment that someone gave you as they were debooting, and now you're gonna like build your whole training program around that? I think that we can use goal alignment, the bite sizing, the pace of the information, right? The collaboration, and the my gosh, where's my brain here? The impact of the change, right? Of the feedback. Is it going to have a big impact on what you're doing to help us filter whether we're taking something on or rejecting it, filing it away? And a rejection doesn't have to be, I'm never going to do that. It might just be, that's not the change I'm focused on now. In terms of how you decide when to move on to some new skill development, right? I think you need to ask yourself, have I made a short-term change here, right? Is this really something that I've just like affected for a few turns? Or have I learned a new skill that's now become ingrained? Am I ready to fold something new into the mix? Is this autonomous for the most part? I think that trying to change multiple things at once is rarely effective for most folks. I don't know if people have had a different experience with that or if that resonates for you, but that's my approach to managing the feedback that comes my way.
I was gonna say, if I could just add to that, I think another piece of this is just permission to reject some of the feedback that you receive. Because I think a lot of people will try to absorb every little piece like it's the Holy Bible, like it's the scripture that they need to implement. And it's okay if something just doesn't completely make sense to you, or it doesn't click with you in particular. Like, I mean, a good example of this just happened to me recently where I have heard something for a number of years. It was something that was known to me. It just never clicked. And then while skiing with Jeb Boyd yesterday, the national team head coach, he did a little something that suddenly just made all of it click for me all of a sudden, right? And so in the past, that feedback just did not work for me, right? It just didn't, the way it was worded, the way it was taught to me, something about it just did not click. And then suddenly, when it was delivered in a slightly different way, it like came together, right?
Yeah, I love that. I think that's the question of impact, right? Is that feedback something you're able to take on, or is it something that just doesn't make any sense? And I agree. You have my permission to reject feedback, even if it comes from me. But not if it comes from Brandon. If it comes from Brandon, you better take it. I think so. When I was on the development team, every understudy, the development team is a level, for those of you who don't know, between after you've obtained level 3, if you're interested in becoming an examiner in one of the disciplines for PSIA-AASI in the Eastern region, you try out for the development team. And then you get the opportunity to understudy a bunch of events that we conduct. And during those understudies, at the end, you will get feedback from the examiner that was leading the event about your performance. And that feedback factors into when and if you get elevated to examiner and get to go out and conduct your own events. And so the understudy schedule is robust. And that means that you get a lot of feedback forms. There's a lot to process, and everyone, is looking to offer you something constructive. But that doesn't mean that it always aligns or that you can act on all of it, right? So the intention is always good, but you have to make choices about what you can work on now. To that end, okay, in deciding how to act on this session, right, I would encourage you to start by thinking about what brought you here today. Were you interested in thinking more about how you receive feedback or how you deliver feedback, right? You probably won't implement all of this at once. But let's say what brought you here was you wanted to really think about, improving the quality of the feedback you deliver, because we do so much of it. So how do you decide where to start? Use the tools that we talked about. What are your goals, right? What is the place that aligns best with your goals? Maybe you find that you're really long-winded out on the slopes and your goal is to be more concise. So you can do that by bite-sizing. Or maybe you found that you're giving feedback, but the student isn't necessarily seeing the value or making the change, right? So could your feedback be more impactful? Are you focusing on do's rather than don'ts? Are you giving people things that are actionable, that they can, that are within their reach of their skill set, and that they're in the mindset to receive? Do you find that you're giving a lot of unsolicited feedback and you want to manage that, right? So in terms of thinking about where you start, you can use the framework we've been talking about to help you figure out what you might want to take out onto the snow with you, right? Maybe it's some of this self-reflection, and what you need is to filter and say, you need to reject some of the feedback, because what you need is to prioritize. Or maybe you want to change the way you respond to feedback. That's something that I'm continuing to work on, because it's important. If we want to grow, we have to take feedback, right? And if we want the people around us to grow, we have to be better at giving feedback. So to wind us down, I just wanted to pull up the people teaching and technical skills fundamentals, and with a greater focus on people and teaching skills. We didn't necessarily reference all of these by name, but I would be very curious if you wanted to share in the chat, what is one of these people or teaching skills that you think we talked about this evening? Which of these are relevant in your feedback delivery? I know some of you are going to say all of them, and while you're not wrong, endeavor to prioritize. Pick some.
I think while people build up the courage to respond, I think a point that I'd like to maybe throw in here. One of the things I really liked you brought up with in terms of receiving feedback is self-awareness, and how we respond to that feedback, but also, right, like there's this. Oh no! Bring that slide back.
Sorry,
I don't have them memorized yet. There's that one under teaching skills here, right? Like that facilitate the learner's ability to reflect upon experiences and sensations. And one of the tools that I've really been trying to embrace is creating self-awareness in the people that I'm trying to teach, not just myself, as far as like receiving feedback. Because an example of this is like a clinic we did where we were trying to do an assessment activity. Somebody requested that we practice it. And the entire group, to be blunt about it, didn't really come close. And that's a hard thing to like try and say as a clinician, like, right? Like that was maybe a 1 or 2 on a score sheet, right? And so the solution was not like to tell everybody like, hey, that sucked. It was, how do you all maybe like think, right? It's like that went for you. And the group was amazingly self-aware. Like I didn't have to say a word. And it was, they're like not even close. Like they all knew it. They all responded that way. And not only did that give me an opportunity not to have to give some not like less than pleasant feedback, but like that also told me that they could reflect on their own performance. And that was also a moment for me to give them some time just to play and continue to experiment, since I knew they knew they weren't doing it well. So here's some time just to go play with it and, you know, use that recognition to their advantage. So.
Yeah, I love that, Brandon. I think when we talk about being collaborative, right? I mean, the word collaborative and that first teaching skills fundamental, collaborate on long-term goals and short-term objectives. But I think that idea of facilitating the learner's ability to reflect upon experiences and sensations is an act of collaboration, right? That's about guiding someone and assessing their understanding, making sure you're on the same page, right? So, and collaboration helps us align better, and making sure that the feedback you're providing is targeted to what people are looking for, right? I also think, you know, what you highlighted in that example is an ability to manage some emotional risk, right? What you had to say kind of sucked, and you found a way into that conversation that was, you know, not Pollyanna, right? It wasn't false positive feedback. I think Allison mentioned that that's a pet peeve of hers, right? But it was a way of delivering feedback that you didn't lose your buy-in or the trust you had built with your audience. So I think that's super great. I managed to lose the thread of the chat here. I don't know how, but
so can you bring it back up, or do you need me to read it?
I've got him here. So I see Rebecca says, without trust, nothing else matters. Yeah, right. I think that trust plays a huge role in how people receive feedback. And we talked about sort of indirectly some ways you can build that, right? With soliciting input from the people you're providing feedback to, with making sure that the feedback you give is actionable, it's relevant, it's wanted. So I think that trust is a big, big umbrella piece of this. I see a number of people mentioning managing information: Regina, Jeffrey, Stefan. Yeah, pacing of information matters, right? When you envision the Avalanche, for me, that's the lesson where you just want to like word vomit everything you know onto a student, without consideration for what they want, what they need, and what will work. I think here we have Riley says, I think identify, understand, and manage your emotions and reactions is an important one. Yeah, right? I mean, we talked about that very specifically and how we receive feedback, but I think that delivering feedback is kind of a test of some of those personality traits as well. So you can use those same sort of exercises about, you know, how I feel and how I respond to help refine your feedback, right? Like, how do I feel when I provide feedback and someone doesn't get it, right? How do I respond to that? How do I feel when I provide feedback and it doesn't work? How do I respond to that? And being able to manage that piece of things can play a big role in your ability to build trust and be a partner. I see you collaborate on long-term and short-term goals. We've definitely talked about that one. Darcy says, working on my awareness of the student's sense of risk. So that's, I think that touches people skills, recognize and influence the behaviors and motivations and emotions of others, as well as manage emotional and physical risk in the teaching environment. I see Mark says teaching and tech skills resonate, but the way you present them makes you sharpen your people skills too. So yeah, of course, it's all interrelated here. But if the technical skills provide us with the information we need to deliver good feedback, and the teaching skills provide us with some kind of framework for how to structure the delivery of that feedback, the people skills, I think, are what guide the extent to which you are going to get buy-in and have impactful feedback, right? What else do we have in here? Regina says engage in meaningful two-way communication, right? We've talked about that a lot, that two-way communication is part of being collaborative. It's part of building trust. Gilbert says feedback needs to be aligned with goals. Yep, absolutely. Deb highlighted adapt to ever-changing needs. When we talk about feedback being targeted and bite-sized, I think that's part of how we adapt to what we're seeing with the learner. When we talk about making sure feedback is relevant, that's part of how we're adapting. Some more we already talked about managing information. Yep. Develop relationships based on trust, David. Yep, absolutely. And then I see Craig jumped in saying developing relationships based on trust and engaging in meaningful two-way communication are the top two, followed by collaboration on long-term goals and short-term objectives to engage the client to see where they are and where they want to be on the continuum toward open parallel turns.
Yes.
And then follow that with meaningful MA by me and some appropriate exercises to address the weaknesses in whatever fundamental you're targeting, to address and correct with non-judgmental feedback. I mean, Craig, that's really the goal. That's a spot-on summary of what we're trying to do. Tink says, if my feedback is not effective, I can repeat it often and louder. So I think he really got a lot of valuable takeaways from this evening about, making sure that he's having a positive impact on his students in the learning environment. And Mark says, absolutely. So I assume he's endorsing Tink there. And then Brandon, you want to weigh in with your comment here?
Sure. No, I didn't want to interrupt you. I think you bring up a really interesting point. You mentioned briefly about what happens when the feedback you provide doesn't work. And I think you really start kind of treading into a challenging task there of not only managing your students' emotions, but your own sometimes, right? That can lead to some frustration in yourself. And also continuing to maybe hammer on the same point over and over, saying the same thing but louder maybe, can also maybe frustrate the students a little bit too, if you continue to just, I think somebody said earlier, beat that dead horse, right? When something's not clicking for somebody. So
yeah, I mean, I think if the feedback's not actionable, right, whether it's because the thing you gave is something your student can't do, or something they don't understand, or something that doesn't apply, right? Whether it's a them thing or a you thing, that's a problem, right? That feedback isn't working. So you need to pivot to something that is actionable. Questions or want to share any any thoughts, takeaways? Yep, please, Tink.
So early on, I put a note in the chat about is your feedback accurate? And we need to be certain in what we're doing. I've been in situations where I've questioned the accuracy of the feedback I'm receiving, whether it's on a ski hill or other places in life. And that leads to a completely different response. And I will actually, believe it or not, I'll actually clam up at that point because my first reaction is bullshit. But I try not to say that anymore. So I'll just step back from the situation at this point. But I become a non-participant.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Tink. Like I said, this chat wasn't about technical skills fundamentals, but accuracy plays a really important role in your ability to build trust with someone, in your ability to promote their sort of reflection and self-awareness, in your ability to create relevant feedback, in your ability to create actionable feedback, right? So I agree. Accuracy is hugely important. I see some people peeling off, so I just wanted to say thank you to those of you who have to jump for being here tonight. I really appreciate your time and your input.